The icy waters of the Delaware River lapped against the wooden boats as General George Washington stood at the bow, his weathered face etched with determination that belied the desperation gnawing at his soul. It was December 25th, 1776, and the Continental Army was dying a slow death of desertion, disease, and despair. Behind him, 2,400 men huddled against the bitter wind, their bare feet leaving bloody tracks in the snow, their uniforms little more than rags held together by stubborn patriotic fervor. The revolution that had begun with such promise at Lexington and Concord was now gasping its final breaths for the catastrophic defeats in New York. Washington's army had retreated across New Jersey like a wounded animal, pursued relentlessly by British and Hessian forces. Pains. Words echoed in the general's mind. These are the times that try men's souls. Never had those words rung more true than on this Christmas night. As Washington prepared to stake everything on one desperate gamble, Colonel John Glover's Massachusetts fishermen worked their oars with practiced precision, navigating the ice-choked river with skills honed on the Grand Banks. The crossing had begun at sunset, but the howling nor'easter had turned what should have been a 3-hour operation into an 8-hour nightmare. Ice chunks the size of millstones crashed against the boat hulls, while sleet drove horizontally into the faces of men already pushed beyond human endurance. Lieutenant James Monroe, barely 18 years old, watched his breath crystallize in the frigid air as he helped guide a cannon onto the New Jersey shore. The young Virginian had volunteered for this mission, knowing it might be his last, but like thousands of others, he believed in something greater than his own survival. The cause of liberty burned in these men's hearts, even as their bodies betrayed them to the merciless winter. By 4 in the morning, the army had finally assembled on the Jersey side, though they were now hours behind schedule. Washington's original plan called for a 3-pronged attack, but word came that neither Colonel John Cadwalader nor General James Ewing had been able to cross the river with their forces. The Delaware had claimed 2/3 of Washington's assault, force before the battle had even begun, according to historical accounts documented in David Hackett Fisher's comprehensive study, Washington's Crossing. The general faced a moment of profound decision as dawn approached on December 26th. His men stood before him, shivering and exhausted, many without proper shoes, leaving crimson stains in the snow. Some officers urged retreat, arguing that the element of surprise was lost and the weather had made success impossible. But Washington saw something in his soldiers' eyes that morning, not defeat, but a grim resolve that matched his own. These were not the summer soldiers and sunshine patriots that Payne had warned against. These were men who had chosen to remain when their enlistments expired at year's end, who had crossed an ice-filled river in a blizzard because they believed in the idea of America more than they feared death. The general made his choice. Despite the delays, despite the reduced numbers, despite the storm that showed no signs of abating, they would continue to Trenton. The Hessian garrison there, commanded by Colonel Johann Raoul, would be celebrating Christmas and nursing hangovers. From their festivities, it was perhaps the last chance to strike a blow that might revive the dying cause of independence. As the Continental Army began its 9-mile march through the snow-covered New Jersey countryside, Washington rode among his men, his presence alone worth a regiment. The fate of a nation rested on this desperate gamble, and every step forward carried them closer to either salvation or destruction. The storm that had nearly destroyed Washington's river crossing now became his greatest ally as the Continental Army trudged through the pre-dawn darkness toward Trenton. Snow fell so heavily that visibility dropped to mere yards, while the howling wind muffled the sound of 2,400 men moving through the New Jersey countryside. What had seemed like nature's cruel joke was transforming into divine providence. Captain Alexander Hamilton, serving as an artillery officer despite his youth, struggled to keep his cannons moving through the deepening drifts. The 20-year-old immigrant from the Caribbean had never experienced such brutal cold, but his determination burned as fiercely as any native-born American's. Behind him, his gun crews pushed and pulled their pieces forward, knowing that these weapons would be crucial in the coming fight. Washington had divided his force into 2 columns for the final approach. General Nathaniel Greene commanded the left wing, which would enter Trenton from the north via the Pennington Road, while General John Sullivan led the right wing along the River Road from the west. The plan required precise timing and coordination, commodities that had been in short supply for the Continental Army throughout this disastrous campaign. As they marched, whispered conversations revealed the true state of Washington's force. Many of the men had not eaten in 2 days, subsisting on nothing but determination and the occasional handful of parched corn. Their muskets were so wet from the storm that firing them would be nearly impossible, making the success of Hamilton's artillery even more critical. Yet none spoke of turning back. General Hugh Mercer, the Scottish-born physician turned soldier, rode alongside Washington as they neared their objective. Mercer had served with distinction in the French and Indian War, and his experience told him that this assault bordered on madness. The odds were stacked impossibly high against them, but he also recognized that desperate times demanded desperate measures. The revolution needed a miracle. Perhaps this Christmas storm would provide it. The two columns separated at Birmingham, with Greene's force taking the longer route to ensure they would strike simultaneously. As Sullivan's men moved closer to the Delaware, they could smell wood smoke from the chimneys of Trenton, where their enemies slept warm and secure in their beds. The irony was not lost on these half-frozen patriots that they were about to attack men who enjoyed the very comforts that had been denied to them for months. Lieutenant Colonel John Stark, the New Hampshire veteran who had distinguished himself at Bunker Hill, led his regiment through the snow with the steady determination that had made him legendary. His men trusted him completely, knowing that Stark would never ask them to do anything he would not do himself. When one of his soldiers stumbled and fell, Stark himself helped the man to his feet, demonstrating the kind of leadership that held this army together when everything else seemed to be falling apart. Historical records preserved in the National Archives reveal that Washington received disturbing intelligence as his force approached Trenton. A loyalist farmer had spotted the American advance and attempted to warn the Hessian garrison, but the storm prevented his message from getting through. Fate, it seemed, was finally smiling on the Patriot cause after months of unrelenting disaster. The general's watch showed nearly 8 o'clock as the outskirts of Trenton came into view through the swirling snow. They were almost 3 hours behind schedule, and daylight was beginning to filter through the storm clouds. The element of complete surprise was gone, but Washington pressed forward. There would be no second chance, no opportunity to retreat and regroup. This single throw of the dice would determine whether the United States of America would survive to see 1770-7 as the two columns took their final positions. Washington gave his officers their last instructions. The password would be victory or death, words that perfectly captured the desperate nature of their situation. They would attack simultaneously, drive straight through the town, and prevent any Hessian escape across the Assunpink Creek Bridge. It was a simple plan born of necessity, relying more on shock and determination than tactical sophistication. The fate of a revolution now hung in the balance. As Washington's frozen army prepared to write one of the most dramatic chapters in American military history, the first shots of the Battle of Trenton rang out at precisely 8 o'clock on the morning of December 26, 1776. As Captain William Washington and Lieutenant James Monroe led an advance guard that stumbled into a Hessian outpost at the northern edge of town. The surprised German sentries managed only a few wild shots before fleeing toward their barracks, shouting warnings that were nearly lost in the howling wind. Colonel Johann Raoul was indeed nursing a severe headache from Christmas celebrations when the commotion began. The 50-year-old Hessian commander had dismissed repeated warnings about American activity in the area, confident that no army would be foolish enough to attack in such weather. As he struggled to comprehend the reports flooding in from his panicked subordinates, the sound of Captain Hamilton's artillery pieces thundering to life at the head of King Street made the situation devastatingly clear. The 18 cannons that Washington had somehow managed to drag across the Delaware and through 9 miles of snow-covered roads now commanded the 2 main streets of Trenton. Hamilton himself sighted the guns, its mathematical precision serving him well as he directed devastating fire down the narrow thoroughfares. The Hessians caught completely off guard. found their own artillery pieces captured before they could be brought into action. General Greene's column struck from the north with the fury of men who had endured months of defeat and humiliation. The 3rd and 4th Virginia regiments, led by Colonel George Wheaton and Major George Johnston respectively, swept through the upper streets of Trenton like an avalanche. These were veterans of the disaster at New York, men who had been retreating for so long that the taste of advancing toward an enemy was intoxicating. On the western approach, General Sullivan's force encountered stiffer resistance as the Hessians attempted to form ranks near the barracks. But the storm that had plagued Washington's crossing now worked entirely in his favor. The German muskets, dampened by hours of exposure to sleet and snow, misfired repeatedly, while the few that did discharge were wildly inaccurate in the swirling wind. Lieutenant Stark's New Hampshire men pressed forward with bayonets fixed, their long months of hardship transformed into cold fury. They had watched their comrades desert, had buried friends who died of disease and exposure, had endured the contempt of civilians who questioned their ability to fight. Now, finally, they had enemies in front of them instead of behind them, and they attacked with the desperate energy of men who had nothing left to lose. As documented in contemporary accounts preserved by the Library of Congress, Colonel Rowell attempted to rally his troops in the center of town, mounting his horse despite his condition and trying to restore order to the chaos. The veteran of European battlefields could not comprehend how this ragged collection of American farmers and tradesmen had materialized out of a blizzard to attack his professional soldiers. His confusion proved fatal as he rode directly into the American line of fire. The Hessian commander fell mortally wounded just as his men began to break and run. Some attempted to escape across the Assunpink Creek Bridge, only to find their path blocked by Sullivan's troops. Others tried to form defensive positions in the streets, but Hamilton's relentless artillery fire made such efforts suicidal. An hour of the first shot, the proud Hessian garrison was in full collapse. Washington himself rode through the streets of Trenton, his presence galvanizing his men as they secured their stunning victory. The general who had presided over so many defeats finally had a triumph to savor, and the transformation in his army was immediate and profound. Men who had shuffled through the snow like defeated ghosts now stood tall with pride restored. The cost of victory was almost miraculously low. Only 2 Continental soldiers died in the fighting, both from exposure rather than enemy fire. Lieutenant Monroe was wounded when struck by a musket ball that severed an artery in his shoulder, but quick medical attention saved his life. The young Virginian would carry the scar as a badge of honor for the rest of his days. In contrast, the Hessian losses were severe. 22 soldiers lay dead, including their commander, while 98 were wounded. Most significantly, over 900 prisoners were taken, along with 6 cannons, numerous small arms, and desperately needed supplies. For an army that had been on the verge of dissolution, such bounty was beyond price. As the storm finally began to clear and pale, winter sunlight illuminated the battlefield. Washington knew that he had achieved far more than a tactical victory. News of Trenton would spread throughout the colonies, proving that the Continental Army could still fight and win. The Revolution had been given the miracle it desperately needed. The sight of nearly 1,000 Hessian prisoners marching through the streets of Trenton under American guard represented more than a military victory. It was a transformation of the entire character of the war. These professional soldiers, who just hours before had been the terror of New Jersey civilians, now trudged through the snow with their heads bowed in defeat, their elaborate uniforms a stark contrast to the patched clothing of their captors. General Washington faced an immediate dilemma as he surveyed his unexpected bounty. His army was in no condition to guard such a large number of prisoners, while simultaneously preparing for the British counterattack that would surely come. The pragmatic solution would be to parole the Hessians on their word not to take up arms again. But Washington recognized the propaganda value of marching these foreign mercenaries through American towns as living proof of Continental Army competence. Colonel John Glover, whose Massachusetts fishermen had made the Delaware crossing possible, now found himself responsible for organizing the prisoner evacuation. The same boats that had carried Washington's army across the ice-choked river would now ferry the captured Hessians back to Pennsylvania, where they would be distributed among various prison camps. Glover's men, many of whom spoke German, from their interactions with immigrant communities served as interpreters and guards. Among the prisoners was Lieutenant Andreas Wiederhold, who had been on duty at the Pennington Road outpost when Washington's attack began. The young German officer would later write extensively about his capture, describing the shock of facing an army that his commanders had assured him was on the verge of complete collapse. His accounts, preserved in Hessian military archives, provide vivid testimony to the impact of Washington's victory on enemy morale. The captured supplies proved almost as valuable as the prisoners themselves. 6 brass cannons would significantly augment Hamilton's artillery, while nearly 1,000 small arms would help re-equip Continental soldiers who had lost their weapons during the retreat across New Jersey. Perhaps most importantly, the Hessian military chest contained desperately needed hard currency, Spanish silver dollars that could be used to purchase supplies from reluctant merchants. Dr. John Cochrane, Army's chief physician, worked tirelessly to treat both American and German wounded in the aftermath of the battle. The Scottish-born doctor had served with Washington since the beginning of the war, and he understood better than most how close the Continental Army had come to complete dissolution. As he tended to Lieutenant Monroe's shoulder wound, Cochrane marveled at how quickly fortune had changed for the patriot cause. Military intelligence gathered from the prisoners revealed the extent of British and Hessian overconfidence in the weeks leading up to the battle. According to captured documents referenced in historical studies by the American Battlefield Trust, enemy commanders had been so certain of American weakness that they had scattered their forces across New Jersey in isolated garrisons, making coordinated response impossible. Washington's intelligence network, led by the mysterious John Honeyman, had provided accurate information about these vulnerabilities. As news of the victory spread through the Continental Army's ranks, the transformation in morale was immediate and dramatic. Men who had been counting the days until their enlistments expired on December 31st suddenly began discussing whether they might be persuaded to remain with the colors. The officers who had privately questioned Washington's leadership now spoke of him with renewed respect and confidence. General Nathaniel Greene, whose column had performed so effectively in the northern assault, recognized that Trenton represented far more than a tactical success. The Rhode Island Quaker-turned-warrior understood that wars were won as much by perception as by force of arms. The image of Hessian professionals surrendering to American farmers would resonate throughout Europe, potentially influencing French attitudes toward providing aid to the rebellion. The logistical challenges of feeding and housing nearly 1,000 prisoners stretched the Continental Army's meager resources to the breaking point. Many of the captured Hessians were suffering from exposure and required medical attention, while all needed food and shelter. Washington ordered that the prisoners be treated with the same care that he hoped would be shown to captured Americans, a policy that would prove wise when prisoner exchanges became necessary. Colonel Joseph Reed, Washington's military secretary, worked through the night preparing dispatches that would carry news of the victory to the Continental Congress in Baltimore and 2 Patriot leaders throughout the colonies. Reed understood the critical importance of rapid communication in maintaining revolutionary momentum. The victory at Trenton needed to be publicized immediately to maximize its political impact. As dawn broke on December 27th, Washington faced a new set of challenges. His army remained vulnerable to British counterattack. His men were exhausted from their night march and morning battle, and the weather continued to deteriorate. The general knew that one victory, however dramatic, could not erase months of defeat and demoralization. The revolution needed more than a single miracle. It needed sustained success to survive. The news of Colonel Rawle's defeat reached British headquarters in New York like a thunderbolt on December 27th, shattering the comfortable assumption that the American rebellion was in its death throes. General William Howe, the British commander-in-chief, had been planning his winter social calendar when dispatches arrived, describing the impossible. Washington's ragged army had not only crossed the Delaware, but had annihilated an entire Hessian garrison in a perfectly executed surprise attack. Lieutenant General Charles Cornwallis, who had been preparing to sail for England on leave, found his departure suddenly cancelled as Howe scrambled to respond to this unexpected crisis. The Earl Cornwallis was arguably Britain's most aggressive field commander, and his reputation for rapid movement and decisive action made him the logical choice to restore British prestige in New Jersey. Within hours of receiving word from Trenton, he was assembling a force of 8,000 men to recapture the initiative. Meanwhile, Washington faced the agonizing decision of whether to remain in Trenton or withdraw back across the Delaware. His army had achieved a stunning victory, but they remained deep in enemy territory with British reinforcements converging from multiple directions. The prudent course would be to return to Pennsylvania with their prisoners and captured supplies, claiming a propaganda victory while avoiding the risk of a devastating counterattack. But Washington understood that retreat, however tactically sound, would squander the psychological momentum that Trenton had created. Throughout the colonies, patriots who had begun to despair were suddenly finding new hope. Recruiting stations that had been empty for weeks were now seeing volunteers and militia units that had dissolved were beginning to reform. A withdrawal to Pennsylvania might preserve the army, but it would also preserve British control of New Jersey. General Greene argued passionately for remaining on the offensive. Despite the obvious risks, the former Quaker had developed into one of Washington's most trusted advisors, and his tactical judgment had been vindicated by the success of his column in the northern assault on Trenton. Greene believed that the Continental Army's reputation for audacity was more valuable than any tactical advantage that caution might provide. The general's decision was influenced by intelligence reports, indicating that British forces in New Jersey were demoralized and scattered. Captain John Honeyman, Washington's most effective spy, had provided detailed information about enemy dispositions and morale. The mysterious double agent, who posed as a loyalist cattle dealer, reported that many British outposts had been abandoned as commanders consolidated their forces in response to the Trenton disaster. According to military records preserved in the George Washington Papers at the Library of Congress, the Continental Army's effective strength on December 28th stood at barely 3,000 men. Hundreds of soldiers had simply disappeared during the confusion following the battle, some deserting, but others becoming separated in the storm and making their way back to Pennsylvania on their own. Those who remained were exhausted, poorly equipped, and facing the imminent expiration of their enlistments. Washington's most pressing concern was the approaching end of the year, when the terms of service for most of his army would expire. The general had already begun the delicate process of persuading men to extend their commitments, offering bounties that the Continental Congress could barely afford. The success at Trenton had improved his bargaining position, but many soldiers remained determined to return home after months of hardship and defeat. Alexander Hamilton, now serving as Washington's aide-de-camp in addition to his artillery duties, worked frantically to coordinate the Army's logistics while simultaneously preparing defensive positions around Trenton. The young officer's organizational skills were being tested to their limits as he juggled the competing demands of prisoner security, supply distribution, and military planning. His correspondence reveals the enormous strain that even victory placed on the Continental Army's limited resources. The civilian population of Trenton presented another challenge for Washington's planning. Many residents had fled when the Hessians occupied the town, but those who remained were caught between conflicting loyalties. Some were genuine patriots who welcomed the Continental Army's return, while others had collaborated with the Germans and now feared retribution. Washington ordered that all civilians be treated with respect, knowing that any atrocities would undermine support for the revolutionary cause. As December 29th dawned clear and cold, American scouts reported British and Hessian columns converging on Trenton from the north and east. Cornwallis had moved with characteristic speed, assembling his force and beginning his advance within 48 hours of learning of Rall's defeat. The British general was determined not merely to recapture Trenton, but to destroy Washington's army once and for all. Washington called a council of war as enemy forces drew near, presenting his officers with a stark choice: They could attempt to defend Trenton against overwhelming odds, retreat across the Delaware, and abandon New Jersey to British control, or pursue a third option that bordered on madness: attack Princeton while Cornwallis was focused on Trenton. The room fell silent as the general outlined his plan to march his exhausted army through another winter night to strike at yet another enemy garrison. The audacity of the proposal stunned even Washington's most aggressive subordinates. Already achieved one miracle. Asking for another seemed to tempt fate beyond all reason. But as they debated through the afternoon, British artillery could be heard in the distance, growing steadily closer. Time was running out, and with it, perhaps the last chance to save the American Revolution. As darkness fell on January 2nd, 1777, Washington's army faced what many considered an impossible choice: stand and fight against overwhelming odds at Trenton, or attempt another desperate night march that could either secure a second miraculous victory or destroy the Continental Army entirely. The British artillery that had thundered all afternoon was now close enough that individual cannon shots could be distinguished. And Cornwallis's advance guard was probing the American defensive positions along Assunpink Creek. The Council of War that convened in Trenton as the sun set was unlike any in military history. Washington's generals, their faces drawn with exhaustion and stress, gathered around a rough wooden table to debate a plan that defied every principle of conventional warfare. General Greene supported the Princeton attack with characteristic boldness, while General Sullivan expressed grave reservations about marching an already depleted army through another freezing night. Captain Hamilton, his youth making him bold, where experience might counsel caution, had spent the afternoon studying maps and calculating distances. The 20-year-old aide-de-camp presented Washington with a detailed analysis showing that a successful march to Princeton would require covering 12 miles of rough country roads in complete darkness while avoiding British patrols. The mathematical precision of his briefing could not disguise the fact that they were planning something that bordered on madness. General Hugh Mercer, whose medical training gave him unique insight into the physical condition of the troops, warned that another night march might literally kill men who were already pushed beyond human endurance. The Scottish physician had treated dozens of cases of frostbite and exposure following the Delaware crossing, and he knew that the Army's reserves of strength were nearly exhausted. Yet even Mercer acknowledged that remaining in Trenton meant certain destruction. As the debate continued, Washington received crucial intelligence from his network of spies and scouts. British forces at Princeton, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Charles Mahood, consisted of only a few hundred men, primarily the 17th and 55th Regiments of Foot, along with some cavalry and artillery. More importantly, these troops were unaware of the crisis developing at Trenton and would be completely unprepared for an American attack. The decision to march came just after midnight, and Washington's scouts reported that Cornwallis had settled into defensive positions for the night, confident that the trapped Americans would still be there in the morning. The British general had made the classic mistake of assuming his enemy would behave predictably, allowing Washington to exploit British overconfidence once again. The Continental Army would slip away in the darkness, leaving their campfires burning to deceive enemy sentries. Historical accounts preserved in the papers of the Continental Congress detail the extraordinary measures taken to ensure secrecy. During the march preparation, wagon wheels were wrapped in cloth to muffle sound, while strict orders prohibited any talking above a whisper. Men who coughed were moved to the rear of the column, and officers carried written rather than verbal instructions to prevent any accidental noise that might alert British patrols, treacherous with ice and hidden obstacles. Many soldiers lacked proper footwear and left bloody tracks in the snow, just as they had during the march to Trenton a week earlier. Yet morale remained surprisingly high. The men who had chosen to remain with Washington after their enlistments expired were the hardest core of American patriots, committed to the cause regardless of personal cost. Colonel John Stark led the advance guard with his New Hampshire regiment, their experience in forest warfare making them ideal for navigating the dark country roads. Behind them came the main body under Greene's command, while General Sullivan brought up the rear with the artillery and baggage train. The formation stretched for nearly 2 miles along the winding roads, a vulnerable snake of humanity creeping through the winter night. Lieutenant James Monroe, still recovering from his shoulder wound, but refusing to miss another historic moment, rode with Washington at the head of the column. The young Virginian would later recall the eerie silence of that march, broken only by the crunch of feet in snow and the occasional squeak of wagon wheels despite their cloth wrappings. The fate of the revolution once again hung on the Army's ability to reach its objective before dawn. Dr. John Cochrane moved constantly along the column, treating men who collapsed from exhaustion or exposure. The physician's medical bag contained precious little beyond bandages and laudanum, but his presence alone provided comfort to soldiers who were pushing their bodies beyond normal limits. Several men died during the march, their hearts simply giving out under the strain. But the column pressed forward without stopping, as the eastern sky began to show the first faint traces of dawn. American scouts reported the lights of Princeton, visible through the bare winter trees. The Army had covered 12 miles in 6 hours, an achievement that seemed impossible given their condition and the weather. Washington allowed himself a moment of quiet satisfaction as he contemplated the surprise they were about to deliver to Lieutenant Colonel Mahood's unsuspecting garrison. The general's watch showed 6 o'clock on the morning of January 3rd. When the Continental Army took its final positions around Princeton, once again Washington had maneuvered his forces into position for a surprise attack, this time against an enemy who had no idea that American troops were within 50 miles. The stage was set for another David versus Goliath encounter that would determine whether the miracle of Trenton had been an isolated event or the beginning of American military resurgence. The Battle of Princeton began at sunrise on January 3rd, 1777, when Captain Hamilton's advance artillery opened fire on British forces attempting to escape the town. Lieutenant Colonel Charles Mulhood had been leading his troops toward Trenton to reinforce Cornwallis when American forces suddenly appeared across his line of march, merging from the morning mist like vengeful spirits. The British commanders? Shock was complete. His intelligence had placed Washington's army trapped at Trenton, not advancing on Princeton with obvious hostile intent. General Hugh Mercer led the initial American assault with his brigade of Virginia and Pennsylvania, troops advancing across the frozen fields toward Mahood's hastily formed defensive line. The Scottish physician-turned-warrior had volunteered for this dangerous assignment, despite his age and medical responsibilities. Driven by the same fierce patriotism that had sustained him through decades of military service, his men followed him with the confidence born of their recent victory at Trenton. The British response was swift and professional. Mahood's regulars, veterans of European campaigns, formed ranks with practiced precision and delivered devastating volleys that sent Mercer's brigade reeling backward. The 17th Regiment of Foot had earned its reputation in battles across the Empire, and their disciplined firepower quickly proved superior to the Americans' enthusiastic but poorly coordinated assault. Within minutes, Patriot attack was in serious trouble. General Mercer himself fell mortally wounded as he attempted to rally his retreating men, struck down by British bayonets as he refused to surrender at the sight of their beloved commander. Falling sent shockwaves through the American ranks, and what had begun as an organized assault dissolved into panicked flight. For a terrifying moment, it appeared that Princeton would become another American disaster, wiping out the gains achieved at Trenton. But Washington himself rode into the chaos at the critical moment, his presence instantly galvanizing the retreating Americans. The general, now 54 years old and gray with the strain of command, personally led a countercharge that drove the British back across the field. Riding between the opposing lines with complete disregard for his personal safety, Washington embodied the kind of inspirational leadership that transforms ordinary men into heroes. Captain Hamilton, meanwhile, had positioned his artillery to devastating effect, pouring canisters shot into the British ranks as they attempted to maintain their formation. The young officer's mathematical precision served him well as he calculated ranges and trajectories, turning his guns into instruments of tactical dominance. The same cannons that had decided the battle at Trenton were once again proving decisive. In determining the outcome of the engagement, as documented in eyewitness accounts preserved by the Princeton Battlefield Society, the tide of battle turned when American reinforcements arrived under General Sullivan's command. These fresh troops, energized by the sight of Washington personally leading the charge, swept forward with irresistible momentum. The British line, already shaken by the intensity of American artillery fire, began to crumble under the renewed assault. Lieutenant Colonel Mawhood, recognizing that his position was hopeless, ordered a fighting withdrawal toward New Brunswick. The British commander had managed his forces skillfully under impossible circumstances, but the surprise and ferocity of Washington's attack had overwhelmed his tactical advantages. His retreat was orderly but decisive, leaving Princeton in American hands for the second time in 8 days. The victory at Princeton was even more complete than the triumph at Trenton. British casualties included over 100 killed, wounded, and captured, while American losses were remarkably light, except for the grievous wound to General Mercer. More importantly, the Continental Army had captured additional supplies, cannons, and military stores that would prove invaluable in the coming campaigns. Washington's double victory in 8 days transformed the strategic situation throughout the Middle Atlantic colonies. British forces evacuated most of their positions in New Jersey, retreating to defensive lines around New York and New Brunswick. The bold offensive that had begun with the desperate crossing of the Delaware had liberated an entire state and restored American confidence in their army's ability to fight and win. The psychological impact of Princeton extended far beyond military considerations. Throughout the colonies, militia units that had disbanded began to reform, while recruiting for the Continental Army improved dramatically. In European capitals, particularly Paris, diplomats began to reconsider their assessment of American military capabilities. The revolution that had seemed doomed just 2 weeks earlier was suddenly alive with new possibilities. General Cornwallis, arriving at Trenton to find his prey had vanished, could only marvel at Washington's audacity. The British commander, one of the most respected soldiers in the empire, had been outmaneuvered by an opponent he had dismissed as amateur. His subsequent retreat to New York marked the effective end of British control over New Jersey and the beginning of a new phase in the Revolutionary War, as Washington's exhausted but triumphant army finally went into winter quarters at Morristown. The general reflected on the miraculous transformation that had occurred since Christmas night. In 10 days, the Continental Army had crossed an ice-filled river, marched over 60 miles in brutal weather, fought 2 major battles, and captured nearly 1,500 enemy soldiers. Most importantly, it had proven that American liberty would not die quietly in the winter snows of 1770-6. The victory that saved a revolution was complete. But Washington knew that Princeton and Trenton were only the beginning. The war for independence would continue for 6 more years, demanding continued sacrifice and determination from soldiers and civilians alike. Yet the precedent had been established: American patriots could face the world's most powerful army and emerge victorious through courage, determination, and inspired leadership. The revolution would survive, and with it, the dream of a free and independent United States of America.